So I'm talking today about populism. I should say that I hope that there's some nuance, but certainly there's not a whole lot of polish here yet. So this paper is very, very green. We finished the first draft of this conference paper last week, which means that we're very, very, very eager for your feedback, particularly the hard questions. So I look forward to hearing what you folks have to say. This is a co-authored effort, so I've been working with Armin Müller, who's at Jacobs University, formerly at the University of Göttingen. He couldn't join us. He's very sad about that and very jealous that I get to come to California to talk about this paper, so I have to bring him some nice stacks of corn tortillas home to Germany to compensate a little bit. So this is our shared work. So, you know, I start my first book with this quote on Greenspan, and I somehow keep coming back to these kinds of big, broad starting points into some of my projects, and I will follow that here. So it goes without saying, really, this is really pointing out the obvious in claiming that there's a lot of public interest in populism. For you folks here in the US, of course, I don't need to say that 2016 was a big year for use of the word populism. Of course, for us in Europe with Brexit, there was a lot that happened and which was referred to as populist in 2016 as well. So the Cambridge Dictionary came along and said in 2017, we're going to declare populism the word of the year. And interestingly, their definition of populism, which not everyone agrees on, is that populism are political ideas and activities that are intended to get the support of ordinary people by giving them what they want. This was quite interesting because one of the big names in comparative populism research. Some of you may know this name, Cas Mudde. In addition to doing great scholarly work, he has a series in The Guardian, writes a bunch of interesting op-eds about populism. And he replied to Cambridge Dictionary and said, no, you people who are in the business of defining words have completely botched things here. You've got it all wrong. So he said that the Cambridge definition, which views populism as essentially a political strategy, or in Mudde's terms, as a political ploy by cynical leaders who kind of want to manipulate quote-unquote ordinary people for their own ends. Mudde says that's not right. You've not really put your finger on populism. We populism researchers take issue with this because it seems your definition seems to imply that non-populist politicians are genuine, that non-ordinary people are politically sophisticated, and that populism has no true substance, and therefore no real critique of the political status quo. So for Mudde, this Cambridge definition was elitist, essentially, and quite unhelpful ultimately. He also went further in a more deeply devastating critique and said that when the Cambridge entry, they had an accompanying blog entry, and they said, you know, in addition to this, the essence of populism as being about a kind of cynical political strategy, it's also fed, motivated, driven by particular concerns and particular issues, particularly immigration and trade, nationalism, and economic discontent. And Mudde said, you botched this as well, you fudged this. This fuels some variants of populism, but this really describes the sort of nativist instincts of the radical right, which has populist forms, but does not describe the sum total of populism per se. So, is there a better definition of populism out there? And here I'm also drawing on Cas Mudde's work, which has generated a big upsurge in research on populism in recent years under the heading of an ideational approach to populism. I like ideational approaches, as Clay has said, and I like this approach to thinking about populism as well. So people working in the ideational camp think of populism as an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups. On the one side, you have the quote-unquote pure people who see themselves as opposed to a corrupt elite. And they also argue that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people, the volonté générale. Others working with this definition have tried to pin this down even a little bit more and suggesting that in this ideology there are essentially kind of three key components. One, this notion of sovereignty in the people, popular sovereignty, or the notion that government is created by and subject to the will of the people, of course, going back to ideas of Rousseau in particular. On the other, another sort of element of populist ideology is, of course, this notion of opposition to the elite, and that the elite doesn't serve the interests of these pure people, and also that there's an explicitly moral dimension to populism, right? That this is a kind of black and white approach to viewing the world, in which people perceive the world as populated by good people and bad people, a kind of black and white notion of things. So this is the notion of populism that we're using in this in our particular study here. One of the advantages of this definition of, or this approach to thinking about populism, as opposed to the Cambridge definition, which in Muda's eyes and also in our eyes restricts populism to this rightist variance, is that it opens up the view that populism exists at either end of a kind of left-right political spectrum. So here, taking examples from Europe, right, the right populists have been making lots of headlines in recent years in France, in the Netherlands, in Germany, just to name a few. But also, Muda and others have argued that there are also very strong leftist variants of populism that have been taking shape in Europe, and also, of course, in Latin America. So in Greece currently, in Spain as well, populism manifests in a more left orientation. So the leftist variants of populism tend to be focused on questions of inequality, and they also, of course, are very concerned with EU austerity policies as well. For the right populists, we know that, of course, immigration is a major touchstone of the rise of rightist variants of populism, in particular in connection with Syrian refugee flows since about 2015. So following Muda then, populism is anti-establishment in all its guises, but takes both leftist and rightist forms in different national contexts. I think it's worth drilling down a little bit here and pointing out, so what are the sort of essence of populist language? How do populists frame their concerns? Again, we see a lot of reference to a pure people defending themselves opposed to a kind of corrupt elite. So here I'm taking an example that's close to my consciousness. I live in Berlin, and fortunately or not, we have to contend with the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland party, the AfD, who very, very explicitly embrace a kind of populist language. So this is one of their big slogans: "We are the people," right? Wir sind das Volk. And this is, here I'm showing you an image that doesn't come from the AfD. This is from the sort of a rightist blogger in the, on the German internet, but this is actually not that far off the way that the AfD talks about Merkel. So in German rightist variants of populism, there's a lot of opposition to the elite, and particularly to the figure of Angela Merkel, who many people blame for having given the green light to refugee flows in 2015. This is a very, very contentious issue in German politics in the moment. So here, this is a very intentionally offensive meme here, with a reference, a direct reference, of course, to Hitler's famous work Mein Kampf. And here, the suggestion is that, you know, this elitist Merkel has been struggling against the people, right? So this is an elite who is out of touch with, oblivious to the concerns of the people, sort of by implication violating this notion of popular sovereignty, making choices not on the interests of in terms of people, but in terms of the selfish interests of the elite, and also struggling against the law and order. So this is sort of, you know, just one example of the way that populist language operates. Okay, so the first 10 minutes of my talk were about nothing to do with China, nothing to do with Asia. And that's because this reflects very much a bias in the literature on populism. So there's been this big upsurge among comparative political scientists on looking at populism, but it's been a really regionally specific phenomenon. So there's much of the, here Kaltwasser has put together some research looking at the populism publications in 14 top political science journals. And of course we see that much of the work has been about Western Europe, surprise, surprise. Also an interest in Latin America. But there's very, very little work on variants of populism in Asia, which is kind of surprising, and we hope to see a bit of a shift there, because there are some obvious examples of Saori and I were talking about this yesterday, Thailand, Philippines, there are some obvious cases that one could turn to. What about China? So it's certainly not the case that the study of populism in contemporary China is, a complete tabula rasa. There have been some important works. I would say that the most important work of recent years is a book that some of you will know of, a very good book by Wenfang Tang, looking at populist authoritarianism. There's a grad student at Penn State, Yayao Dai, who's also done some very good work on populism. But still, the existing research on populism is very, very limited. I'll talk a little bit about this book by Wenfang Tang because it's a nice kind of entry point into our research. The essence of his argument, as I read it, is that sort of populist elements in the Chinese Communist Party's approach to rule is the key, perhaps, to understanding China's puzzling authoritarian resilience, right? So this notion of, why has the CCP managed to survive and indeed thrive despite these pressures of modernization? And Tang's answer, drawing on decades of survey research and masses of data, is essentially that the CCP has been extremely successful in utilizing the tools of the quote-unquote mass line. So this is an approach to governance which sees governance as flowing from the masses to the masses, right? So that the CCP gathers ideas from the people, sort of processes them, and concentrates them within the party, and then propagates them back to the masses. And Tang's argument is that this commitment to a mass line approach to governance ensures a high degree of regime accountability and responsiveness to society, and then in turn translates into strong public support for CCP rule, which is something that has been found over and over again in the various survey-based literature on public opinion in China. So here we're sort of marking out our kind of approach to this question now. So the question that that really inspires our approach here, and Clay has really hit on the essence of this already. So does the CCP have a monopoly on populism in China? So Wenfang Tang has done a marvelous job of articulating the operation of what we might think of as top-down populism in China, right? So against the backdrop of this ideological and practical commitment to the mass line and to staying responsive to the needs of the people, from the perspective of party ideology, there is no division between the elites and the people. There can be no pure people versus the corrupt elite, because in fact the CCP is the people, right? And when we look at the imagery and sort of folksy rhetoric that Xi Jinping has embraced, it's very clear that the party, at the moment, really wants to double down on this image of itself as truly embodying the people. And what we are trying to do with this project is to say, okay, well, this top-down populism exists and is important, and maybe very key to unraveling the puzzle of China's authoritarian resilience, but is there something more to say here? So is there a bottom-up populism? Is there a Chinese variant of populism that, following Muda and others, perceives a pure elite opposed to a corrupt elite? So that's what we're trying to explore here. And we think, to our knowledge, this is something that there's as yet no work on. So this place to start then is to say, well, why would you even expect there to be any kind of oppositional forms of populism under the conditions of the CCP's resilient authoritarianism? So we turn to the literature that has been the comparative populist literature, which has been really, really concerned with the role of an emergence of populism under conditions of electoral democracy, which you might think is kind of a weird place to start, but that's what we have before us. And so we started with a very interesting and important recent work that tries to sift through what triggers populist attitudes under conditions of electoral democracy. And the essence of this paper by Hawkins, Reed, and Powles is that there are sort of various kinds of background conditions and triggers that give rise to populist attitudes. On the one hand, one of the background conditions that's really important is a widespread belief in democracy, particularly a widespread embrace of this notion of popular sovereignty, right? That government ought to happen in the name of the people, and also that it should be created by and subject to the will of the people. So that's one of the sort of what Hawkins et al. Emphasizes as the key background condition of the emergence of populist attitudes. In addition, there has to be some sort of policy failure. In particular, big instances of corruption is typically one of the triggers of populist attitudes in their framework. And then you need a supply of populist politicians. You need a Frauke Petry or a Marine Le Pen to sort of crystallize these narratives about the failure of these immoral elites, which then in turn also feed populist attitudes. And then you need organizational frameworks, political parties, social movements to give force essentially to these populist attitudes. And then ultimately you have taking shape from that populist governments even as a result of these kind of triggers and then background conditions. So these are, according to Hawkins et al., the kind of drivers of populism under conditions of electoral democracy. What we are, one of the purposes or one of the aims of this paper that we have just written is to kind of sketch out what a corollary to this trigger theory of populism might look like under conditions of authoritarianism. And so this is what we kind of sketched out. Of course, populism, the triggering of populist attitudes, the nature of those attitudes, the impact of those attitudes, of course, looks very, very different under conditions of authoritarianism. But we think that relaxing some of these assumptions from this model and modifying them to situate, to work with conditions of authoritarianism gives us something to kind of work with here. So on the right side, we have this kind of model that we're thinking about. So you do need, we think, a widespread belief in democracy in order to have a form of, a latent form of authoritarianism. Sorry, a latent form of populism under conditions of authoritarianism. This is likely, given that we're talking about authoritarianism and about the CCP here, I expect that this is going to be the aspect of the model that raises the most eyebrows. So I'm going to leave this for a discussion in a couple of minutes and talk about the other aspects that we think are important here. You also need a policy failure, something to inspire sort of grievances and dissatisfaction with the government, corruption. When we look at the case of China, of course, it's not hard to see when we look at the scale of the corruption that has been uncovered since the anti-corruption campaign got going in 2012, this is indeed something that China confronts. We don't, of course, have an equivalent to a Marine Le Pen in the Chinese political system, but we do have on social media, on Weibo, in certain pockets of the media, in the form of quasi-independent journalists, people who bring attention to cases of official venality or draw attention to problems of corruption. And oftentimes these particularly egregious cases then go viral on Chinese social media. So this is certainly not the equivalent of populist politicians, but these are people who might serve to sort of fan the flames of populist views. So we think that this combination of policy failure, of widespread corruption, paired with these opinion leaders on Chinese social media, might give rise to a kind of weak form of populist attitudes. So people that perceive an elite as violating the interests of the people, but not necessarily that who would have the audacity to create a meme of Xi Jinping calling him a traitor and a sellout of the people's interests, right? So this is certainly also a different form of populist attitudes than we would find under conditions of electoral democracy. What about what's the corollary? The counterpart to organizational frameworks under conditions of authoritarianism. Of course, we're working inductively here from the Chinese case. And we think that there are no movements currently or political parties to kind of channel these populist attitudes towards some kind of oppositional movement vis-a-vis the elites, but we do have these contention frames. So we think of the work on rightful resistance, O'Brien and Lee, and Diana Fu's excellent recent work on forms of disguised collective action. So we do have these contention frames that, paired with weak populist attitudes, might give rise to kind of sporadic expressions of dissatisfaction with the state. Okay, back to democracy. So we are implicitly making the claim here that in China we see the different aspects of this model in place, including a widespread belief in democracy. This is, like I said, likely to raise a few eyebrows in this room, but we're sticking to our story. And I think that when you look at lots of different forms of data, the World Values Survey over various waves tell this story pretty clearly. That Chinese people do really strongly embrace a belief in democracy, and we don't think this is a contradiction in terms to claim that this could exist under authoritarianism. And we have a little explanation for why we think this is the case a bit down the road. But so we see here, looking at the most recent World Values Survey data, that about 71% of respondents see, and they have a nationally representative sample here, see democracy as a good way of governing China. So people like democracy. But this is where things get complicated. It seems to be the case, and there isn't actually enough research on this topic. Some brilliant graduate students in the room, I think this is something well worth pursuing, because there isn't enough known about exactly what people have in mind when they embrace this notion of democracy. But this is some really interesting research that comes out of from a scholar from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who did a survey in 2011 and asked people, what is democracy? So when you talk about democracy, are you talking about a system of periodic elections in which national leaders are chosen through competition between political parties? Or are you talking about a system in which government leaders reflect people's interests, serve the people, and submit to the supervision by the people, right? And the numbers are pretty interesting here. So a small minority of people conceive of democracy in terms of electoral changes of government, but the vast majority of people define democracy in the terms provided by the CCP, right? That the CCP needs to serve the people, but this is not done primarily through the mechanism of elections. Instead, it's achieved via the mass line. This is quite interesting. So Chinese people seem to embrace a notion, a concept of democracy. It's a kind of idiosyncratic concept of democracy, and they also believe that they live in a democracy, or at least a fairly large number of people. So this is another question from the most recent wave of the World Values Survey. How democratically is this country being governed today? Of course, there's a range here of opinion, no question about that. But a fairly sizable number of people seem to believe that China is in fact being governed democratically. So how do we understand this? One of the really interesting things that we've seen occur under Xi Jinping, and this is kind of striking given what we know about the increase in repression in recent years, is that party theoreticians have become increasingly vocal, increasingly confident in referring to China as a democracy. And their preferred term at the moment is referring to China as a socialist deliberative democracy in which people are the masters of the state. So this is something that is consistent, one finds consistently currently in Chinese Communist Party official ideology. And the justifications or the stories that are told about the emergence of this democracy are quite interesting. And theoreticians tell us that this deliberative democracy is a kind of path-dependent phenomenon that combines a modern and traditional political culture. This article that I cite is quite interesting for those of you who are curious about this story. Okay, so getting to our empirics here. We have been building the case that one ought to find kind of weak forms of populist attitudes in China because we think these conditions of our model are satisfied in the Chinese case. So we got together and we organized a survey. This was an online survey that was conducted in August of last year with a Berlin-based survey company. The survey company used a river sampling method, meaning that respondents were recruited through ads on websites and as well as apps, offering them monetary and non-monetary rewards, so points for gamers, that sort of thing. We had a good sample size, about 2,000 respondents. We used sampling quotas based on age, gender, and region, and having used those sampling quotas, we think that we get something close to a representative sample of China's internet-connected population, right? So this is, of course, doesn't give us a view of the opinion of people who are offline. This is mostly a rural phenomenon. So, we are very upfront in saying that there are limitations to our data set. Nevertheless, for urban, internet-connected China, we think that we have something close to a representative sample here. So how do we go about thinking about populism, or what were the measures that we used to think about trying to measure these weak populist attitudes? We turned here to the comparative literature. There's a very thriving research network called Team Populism. Kirk Hawkins and Cass Muda and Kaltwasser are some of the people involved in this organization. And they have been, over the years, working through a populism scale to try and, which has been tested in electoral democracies and is constantly being refined. And so we used a version of this populism scale that was used in a 2017 study of populism in the Netherlands. And we had to modify it slightly for the Chinese case. And here, just looking at the different aspects of this scale, so POP1 and POP2 seem to evoke this popular sovereignty notion. A country's leaders should follow the will of the people. The people, and not the country's leaders, should make our most important policy decisions. POP3 and POP5, for reasons I'll explain in a second, POP4 kind of drops out. We added that in, hoping to use it to replace a question which really didn't fit the Chinese context, but it doesn't work at all. So I'll talk here about POP3 and POP5. POP3 and POP5 evoke the more kind of oppositional dimensions of populism. So the political differences between the elite and the people are larger than the differences among the people. POP5, state officials talk too much and take too little action. So thinking back to this Venn diagram that we had, right, we have covered all the bases here. We think in terms of these different aspects of populism. Popular sovereignty, opposition to the elite, and then this Manichaean division between good and evil. So when we looked at how our populism scale worked, there was some good news and some bad news. So the good news was that these imported questions that we borrowed from other folks worked quite well, but our imported question, thinking about populism in relation to education as a necessary prerequisite for participating in politics, didn't work out. So POP4 had quite weak correlations with our oppositional dimensions of the populist scale. So we dropped it entirely from our consideration after the study. But otherwise, the correlations between these questions look pretty good, suggesting that people who these questions all work to some degree in the same direction. Our next step was then to use this scale and to look at how this shapes opinion about the state, particularly looking at political trust data and then measures of government satisfaction. And we'll look in a second a little more closely about what these measures are. But when we did this correlational analysis, we found something kind of curious. So POP5 and POP3, these are the oppositional dimensions of this populist scale seem to correlate negatively with trust and satisfaction measures, right? So suggesting that people who strongly subscribe, strongly endorse POP 5 and POP 3 are less satisfied and less trusting of the state, whereas people who embrace the popular sovereignty aspects of this populist scale have, particularly POP 1, display weak positive correlations with the trust and satisfaction measures. So this made us scratch our head a little bit. What's going on here? And then we said, wait, maybe what we're up against are two kind of variants of populism here, right? So remember we started with that Venn diagram with the three aspects of populism, and populism in other national contexts is conceived as being composed of these three elements. But maybe in the Chinese case, right, in which you also have the operation of this top-down populism, maybe populist attitudes move in a red direction and then in a critical direction. So it could be that these people we call red populists, right, subscribe to this notion of popular sovereignty. A country's leader should follow the will of the people and not the country's leader should make our most important policy decisions. This is not that different than what the CCP itself says, right? This is the mass line in other terms. So you could think of this as popular sovereignty with Chinese characteristics. So you can believe that and also be very, very loyal to the CCP, loyal to the Chinese state, right? Where populism takes on these oppositional critical dimensions, right, is on these sides of the triangle in terms of the opposition to the elite and this moral division between good and evil. So we kind of think maybe our correlational analysis points to the existence of these two very different kinds of populism. So we went back to the data and we created a scale measure for these two kinds of species of populism. So, we define a red populist as those people who endorse the popular sovereignty aspects of populism, but who don't strongly embrace these oppositional measures of populism, whereas the critical populists say yes kind of across the board. And again, these red populists are red, right, since they appear to embrace the CCP's top-down populism framed in the terms of serving the people and embracing the mass line. And so one of the things that was jumped out at us across the bat was that when using our scale measure, red populists are kind of surprisingly few in number. So there were 5% of our sample was red populists, and 16% of our sample were critical populists. So these would be the people that Fincher is talking about, who are involved in social movements, who are organizing environmental protests. So we think we found something kind of interesting here, and then we thought, okay, well, let's go back to the data and see how, if these different, as a kind of test of whether these two variants exist or not, we then went back to this trust and satisfaction data and looked to see whether this makes a difference in terms of how people look at, conceive of political trust and government satisfaction. And it kind of follows our expectations. So what we see across the board for these measures of political trust, which ask people the degree to which they trust their local leaders, their provincial leaders, and their central leaders, is that the red populists are very, very loyal to the state across the board, are trusting of political officials. And critical populists are both less trusting of local leaders at all levels of the state than the overall sample, and of course also less than these red populists. One of the things that you might sort of wonder about here is why does the data have this kind of ladder aspect to it? And this reflects a phenomenon of hierarchical trust, which is kind of interesting in the Chinese case and has been found over and over in survey research, which is that Chinese people tend to have lowest degrees of trust in their local leaders, but invest a lot of political trust in central leaders. When we looked at, one of the things that was kind of interesting when we looked a little bit closer at the data is that these critical populists have the lowest gradient of political trust among these different categories. So not only is their trust in local leaders lower than everyone else, but their incremental improvements in trust levels going successively up a level are also lower than these other categories, suggesting that they don't see these central leaders as a huge improvement over their local leaders who are more visible to them. And then we also looked at the data on various aspects of government satisfaction. And one of the things, and we found the same pattern as we did with the trust data. And one of the interesting things, coming back to our kind of framework of thinking about the triggers of latent authoritarian populism, the biggest gap in the perceptions of state performance we found with regard to clean government. So critical populists and red populists are farthest apart in their judgments of how the state manages corruption. And critical populists seem to be significantly more concerned about this than red populists. Okay, winding up here. So who are these Chinese populists? We have a section in the paper that looks fairly closely at the demographics of this dynamic. What we can sort of summing up here, red populists are older, they're highly educated, they're overwhelmingly male. So red populists, 73% in our sample were male, which is kind of interesting. This is consistent with the gender characteristics of right populism in Europe, but diverges quite substantially from the gender characteristics of populism in Latin America. We don't have a very good explanation for that at the moment, but it's something we're trying to work through. They are economically secure. About 97% of our red populists are employed full-time, and they also perceive themselves as doing well economically and are quite positive about their future economic prospects, and they're also likely to be members of the CCP, slightly more likely than the rest of the sample. So about 23% of our red populists were CCP members. Critical populists are younger, highly educated, slightly more likely to be male than the overall sample, slightly less economically secure, and slightly more likely than the overall sample to be a member of the CCP. So we think that this, that you might say, okay, well, these critical populists, a substantial chunk of them are actually members of the CCP. How do you explain that? Well, that's something we're thinking about, and we'd love to hear your ideas on this. But what our data overall, the demographic data overall suggests is that both of these variants of populism in China are kind of top of the social pyramid phenomenon. So when you look at our sample generally reflects a high degree of education within the sample, right? So these 67% of our sample are post-secondary degree holders. Again, this is a bit of a limitation of doing online survey measures, so we need to do ultimately a nationally representative survey on this. But when you compare those numbers to red populists and critical populists, you see that both versions of populism reflect people who are even more highly educated in the overall sample. And that CCP membership, because we know that the CCP recruits the best and the brightest, kind of reflects this top of the social pyramid as well. And this is also reflected in the economic security of these two groups relative to the overall sample. Okay, so what can we take away from this? And now this was another aspect of the data that we thought was kind of interesting. So it would seem that red populism is essentially non-existent among China's ethnic minorities. Now we have to be a bit careful about the conclusions we draw here because we didn't have a huge number of non-Han ethnic minorities in our sample. Nonetheless, it seems as though red populism in particular is a phenomenon exclusive to Han Chinese. And that also that non-Han ethnic minorities, a much larger proportion of these respondents embrace a critical form of populism. Of course, when you look at what's happening in Xinjiang and the general repression of minority rights in various parts of China, this is not hugely surprising, but we think it's fairly noteworthy. Okay, so what can we kind of take away from this work? We think that we have some empirical support for our latent authoritarian populism theory. So it seems to offer support for the claim that authoritarianism, even heavily repressive variants as we have in China, may in fact furnish the conditions for the emergence of bottom-up populism. And we think that our data suggests that the CCP does not have a monopoly on populism in China. So the CCP's official populism, top-down populism, appears to have the intended effect in certain segments of the population. The party claims to serve the people, and that belief is then reflected back in a portion of public opinion, these red populists. But on the other hand, we also have these critical populists. And these critical populists embrace the oppositional dimensions of populist ideology, along with a belief in popular sovereignty, and they are in turn much less satisfied with the state across the board. But at the same time, we have to be cautious about, what do we take away from this in terms of Chinese politics. It's certainly not the case that critical populists are any form of opposition in waiting, right? So the government satisfaction and political trust results suggest that they are more critical of CCP rule, but by no means on the verge of revolt. And this also suggests the limitations of survey research. Without doing focus groups, without doing detailed interviews with people who show up as critical populists, using our scale, it's difficult to know what ultimately they have in mind. So, does all of this matter, right? So if China's critical populists will not bring down the CCP in the foreseeable future, and if there are no supportive structures to sort of give action to these latent, weak forms of populist attitudes, should the CCP really be worried? Well, even if there's not a sort of imminent revolt suggested in this data, we still think it's important. We still think it's a kind of worthwhile angle in thinking about Chinese politics, because on the one hand, it reveals a surprising degree of disconnect between the state's legitimation strategy and citizens' view of the state, right? And we also think that and this is quite, this is a matter of speculation to some degree, but it might help to explain what is a kind of puzzling turn toward a harder form of authoritarianism under Xi Jinping, right? If corruption is a big driver of critical populist attitudes, then it makes a whole lot of sense that pairing this big crackdown on corruption, which has brought to light the scale of corruption among the political elite, that it makes some intuitive sense that the state might pair that with heightened repression. But again, this is speculative, and this is something that we can't really answer on the basis of this data. Future lines of research. We think that definitely we have to be careful about claiming the representativeness of our data. A nationally representative survey might change the picture substantially. There are also some kind of fundamental limitations of survey research which call for other approaches. So we think that qualitative research on populism using focus groups or participant observation or interviews would be really really helpful, as well as discourse analysis of, for example, populist narratives posted on Chinese social media, as well as experiments possibly. So thanks for listening so much, and I'd love to hear your comments and questions. Thanks very much.